The Charlotte Podcast Festival is presented by Blumenthal Performing Arts, the Queen City Podcast Network, Eclecs Creative Agency, and WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source, the home of acclaimed podcast Charlotte Talks, She Says, The List, Amplifier, Southbound, and FAQ City. Learn more about WFAE and our latest podcast, Work It, at WFAE.org.
I want to thank you guys all for joining us. Welcome to the Charlotte Podcast Festival. My name is Brian Baltosiewich. I'm with the Queen City Podcast Network here in Charlotte, and very, very pleased to be a part of this festival with the good folks at WFAE, Blumenthal Performing Arts, and of course, Eclecs Creative Agency. This is Charlotte's first podcast festival. We're about 3 weeks into it, about a little over 1 week left, and the response has been tremendous. We want to thank everybody who's done anything at all to kind of help us spread the word about this festival. The 13,000 of you who have registered for events, it goes way beyond anything that we could have imagined. So thank you so much for participating and coming out and just being so awesome, just being great podcasters. We sure appreciated it. So this session is all about what to do once you have your podcasts ready in the can, recorded, edited, you're happy with the product you have, and now what do you do, right? We are going to have a conversation tonight. There are two of us here. I will introduce my presentation partner here in just a moment. Like I said before, if you have questions for us, leave them in the chat. We will get to the questions that you have along the way as they fit into the conversation. Also, there will be some time for Q&A afterwards for both of us. Please keep your audio muted for the session and leave your questions in the chat room. As I mentioned before, this session will be recorded and made available over email later this month. Make sure you check your emails, including your spam folder, junk folder, promotions folder, anywhere else it might go, to receive the session recording at the end of the festival later this month. You'll get an email for the sessions that you registered for. We want to encourage you. So coming up the next week, a big happy hour tomorrow night, where you guys can kind of mix and mingle with other podcasters. But next week, a full list of sessions about kind of everything, some things you need to think of, some things maybe you didn't think of. Legal aspects for podcasts, right? Can I use copywritten music in my podcast? There's a whole session about the legal things involving a podcast that you may not necessarily think of. You can check out the whole schedule at charlottepodcastfestival.com and also register for sessions there. Next week is a really, really good week. There's a lot of really good stuff. Like I mentioned, legal aspects, how to monetize your podcast. Who among us isn't interested in that? And also a session on burnout and how to avoid it. There's a statistic out there that the majority of podcasters burn out after 4 months. They call it pod fade, and people just get tired of the grind. They didn't realize how much work it is, and they just grow tired of it. We got a whole session that's going to talk about how to avoid it. So I'm moderating that one myself. I'm looking forward to finding out how to avoid the burnout that I've been feeling for that's not true, for the last 5 years. Not true at all. You can also support the festival by purchasing a brand new t-shirt. They're really, really cool. You can get one from charlottepodcastfestival.com. You may have noted that it's free to attend the podcast festival. If you like what you're doing, pick up a t-shirt or two at the festival. That just helps us and the good folks at WFAE offset some of the cost that we've incurred putting this thing on. And of course, if you are planning on using some social media, sharing about the sessions that you've attended, and telling folks how awesome the festival is, use the hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. Hashtag CLT Podcast Fest. Drop that hashtag on social media. Help spread the word about the cool stuff happening in Charlotte for podcasters. So okay, so let's get started. You've recorded your podcast. You are ready to release your podcast, but now what is your next step? How do you release it, and what do you need to do to prepare for your release? If you build that they'll come doesn't necessarily work for podcasts, so you need to kind of think about what you are going to do. So joining me for this session is Rashmili Vemula. And I'm going to, here we come, Rashmili. I'm going to spotlight you. There you are. Rashmili Vemula is here. She is the host of the Carolina Desi podcast here in Charlotte. And she's going to talk a little bit about the things that kind of the best practices, what to do once you have your podcast locked and loaded and ready to go. And she's also going to talk a little bit about the things that she wished she had done when she launched her own podcast. So Rashmili, the room is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. So like Brian mentioned, I do co-host the Carolina Desi podcast, and my co-host and I have been doing it for about 3.5 years now. At that time, there were very few South Asian focused podcasts. So it was the perfect time for us to get started, and we're a 2-person team. So we did everything ourselves, and we are continuing to do everything ourselves as well. So as far as the assumptions that we stated before, which is you have all your content recorded, you are ready to launch, what is next? The other assumption that I want to make is that you have a backlog of recorded content already ready to go. Maybe it's not all edited, but I would say minimum 3 to 4 episodes and recommended 6 to 8 episodes of backlog content ready to go. Just because Brian and I were talking about this, if you want to go on vacation one week, or you are just unable to record something, get it out there because you're so busy, it's nice to have that backlog ready to go. The backlog might not always work if your content is focused around current events. You just have to be on point for getting that as quickly as possible. But sometimes if you want to switch it up, it's nice to have that backlog as well. As far as what we wish we did, so we did all that part, right? We got 3 to 4 episodes of content ready to go. We got all of our socials up. We submitted our hosting services. We submitted it to aggregators, etc. What I do wish we did was that build a community around the content, no matter how niche it is, build a community around it before launching. So you could kind of tease those episodes. I mean, this is again, assuming you have those episodes already. So you could create so much marketing content just from your recorded episodes that you already have. So what I wish we did was, I don't know, have a marketing strategy on Instagram, for example, and have weekly posts or every few days of, hey, this is what's coming up. Here are the topics that we want to cover for this season or for the next quarter, etc. Here is the audience that we want to reach, all that fun stuff. Kind of wish we did that community aspect of it prior to launching, because it was a little bit harder to grow right after launching. Now we had a few episodes out there in the ether, and we're like, okay, yeah, building it and asking them to come or just waiting for them to come is not always going to work, no matter how good your content might be. It's just, sometimes it's hard to find, or people don't know what to search for. So having that community aspect ready to go, it's just a basic marketing strategy, which we didn't do, and I wish we did. As far as having a website, for example. So my co-host had his own website. He was already using it. It was sharing all the information of what he currently works on. And the podcast happens to be one of the things he was working on. So we were like, okay, we'll just add a subpage onto his website and call it a day. I think we would have probably benefited a little bit more for a standalone landing page for specifically the podcast. I feel like that would have changed it a little bit, but not as important as what I mentioned before about the community aspect of it. Yeah, I think those are the items that we wish we did. Did I miss anything, Brian, about pre-launching episodes?
I don't think so. I think to your point about having a few episodes kind of in the can and ready to go. If your podcast is not especially timely, so if you're not talking about something that's happening this weekend, which is kind of a whole other conversation too, right? So podcasts don't necessarily lend themselves to real sort of urgent, timely things, because if you're promoting an event or talking about a thing that happened this weekend or last weekend, a year from now, that's not necessarily going to mean a whole lot to a whole lot of listeners as they come back and find your podcast. So But if you are talking about something super timely, maybe you have a football related podcast and you're previewing this weekend's games or something like that. You almost have to record and release those podcasts in the same week. In fact, not almost. You do have to record and release those in the same week. But if you have the ability to stockpile some episodes, try to do that. I always recommend erring on the side of almost having too many episodes in the can already. I recommend 6 to 8, if not more than that, episodes. This way, if you're releasing every week, you've got 2 months worth of episodes in the bank, and then you can God forbid, get the flu, maybe not feel good one week and need to take a week off, or like Rashmili said, you want to take a vacation. We should be able to take a week off. The one thing that you don't want to do is get into the situation where, oh shoot, it's Tuesday night, I'm supposed to release the podcast every Wednesday at noon, and I should probably go record something. You don't want to live your life like that. So make sure that you've got, if possible, a stockpile of episodes, even if it's only a couple weeks. But aim for 6 to 8 episodes. I have one podcast that I'm producing for a client. We just recorded 26 interviews before we even launched the first segment. So we've got literally, we could stop recording interviews from now until March and we would be just fine. So you can never have too much content in the bank already, I think is really kind of what we're trying to say. Rashmili, you said that you worked on creating a community for your podcast. Now, your podcast in particular kind of lends itself to community. Can you talk a little bit more, and it's coming your way in the spotlight right now, can you talk a little bit more about kind of how you created that community, the kind of groundwork you laid down before you even launched the podcast?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to clarify. We did not start a community. That's what we wish we did. Okay. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use another podcast that I liked as an example, that they built a community. It so happened that both of those co-hosts have their own brands, their own growth as well on social media. I'm sure that helped a lot. But what they did for their podcast was, for about maybe 2 months, they were teasing the podcast, and they already set their hard deadline of when they were going to launch. So let's say maybe in November or October or November of last year, all the way through the end of the year, they were saying, we're going to launch our podcast in January. So for the next 3 months, they were posting snippets, like audio snippets, video snippets. They were posting pull quotes, just all types of content recorded episodes that they had already created. So building that community and also starting to engage your audience, potential audience in that case, starting to engage them, like, what type of topics do you want to hear? Is this something that you're even interested in? Is this too niche for you? And kind of giving them the platform to speak, because in the end, you're creating this podcast for your community and your audience, and you want to make sure they're included and have a voice in those conversations as well.
Yeah, I think everybody, we're all proud of the work we're doing. We're all proud of our podcast. We all want people to listen. And I think, it's easy to kind of, and I'm going to call it a trap, and I don't mean it in a negative way, but it's easy to sort of fall into that trap of, like, I've got this great content. I can't wait for people to hear it. I need to rush it out. It's okay to be, to be conscious of your timeline and to wait a little bit to release your podcast. And if you wait a little bit and kind of take the time to develop that community, to grow that community, to create some buzz around what your podcast is going to be, and then wait a little while before you release it. It's okay to do that. Everybody wants to release their podcast right away, and I totally get that. But but don't be afraid to be a little pragmatic, a little bit the word I'm searching for escapes me, but plan out, your release, plan out your social media presence, plan out, what will turn into the relentless self-promotion of your podcast, and be specific and very careful about how you're setting things out. So don't necessarily rush it out just because it's done. It'll still be in the same form it is. But let yourself grow organically before you even release. Let people know that it's coming. We do have a question. Let's see. Mark David Miller has about 2,000 contacts on LinkedIn, and his podcast is focused on international trade. He's will launch it after the election and wants to know how he can leverage his LinkedIn contacts to hit the ground running and build my community based on those contacts. I'll go first, Rashmili, but I think start creating conversations, on your LinkedIn with your contacts now. So start putting out questions. Whatever your first topic is, start putting out questions about that now. Hey, do you think that, trade will be better under Biden than it will be under Trump? How will Joe Biden treat China differently than President Trump does? Create conversations now, and then kind of slowly start to guide those conversations toward, these are the things we're going to be talking about during my podcast, which launches on such and such a date. Don't miss it. It's all about the things that you're interested in. Just play little clips from interviews that are specific to things that are happening right now. Don't be afraid to start the promotion now, and then when you launch, people are ready for it. That you've kind of greased the skids a little bit, and people have a sense of what's coming, and they're going to want to tune in. But Mark, don't be afraid to start. Don't just spring it on everyone. Don't be afraid to take a couple weeks right now and leading up. Now, if you are going to specifically talk about Trump and Biden, you're going to get lost in the wash just a little bit, particularly over the next couple weeks, and certainly, heaven knows, over the couple weeks after the election. But be patient. Use the appropriate hashtags. Don't be afraid to spend a little bit of money on social media, and just get your message out in front of as many people as you can. Rashmili?
Yeah, that's great. I actually don't have too much more to add. What Brian said is very true. If you do have the budget for those marketing strategies, then why not? And it seems like you have a good understanding of your potential demographic and of your audience being on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn's algorithm for sharing non-personal content is actually pretty good. It has quite the reach, but if you appropriately use those hashtags. So I'd have to agree with Brian on that.
Thanks, Rashmili. I appreciate it. So question from Jonathan Levine has a narrative storytelling approach based on countries around the world with local correspondence. He says it's very time consuming and costly to develop. In the meantime, he's working on soliciting partners and sponsors to help promote it, but it's slow going with people preoccupied with COVID. He's banking a lot of episodes before launch. He says banking a lot of episodes before launching is going to be hard. How terrible is it, he asked, to launch 3 or 4 episodes and then take time to develop the next 3 to 4? Rashmili, do you want to take that first, and then I'll weigh in?
Yeah, sure thing. So like I mentioned, we launched with 3 to 4 episodes, and we spent the next few weeks or so preparing for the next 3 to 4. It didn't really hurt us, especially, most likely because of the content or the demographic we were trying to reach. But if you are willing to put in the same amount of time to keep up that consistency and keep up that same amount of effort that it takes to do it in those small segments, then I don't think it would hurt you. But that's me speaking from personal experience, and maybe we should have done 6 to 8 episodes, but I think it's fine.
I 100% agree with what Rashmili said. However, I'm going to say this. So one of my golden rules of podcasting is that you've got to be there when you tell your listeners you're going to be there. So if you tell them, we're going to have a new episode every single Wednesday and it's going to drop at noon, then you've got to be there every single Wednesday dropping at noon, even if it means, doing a best of episode or some sort of clip show. If you do find yourself, needing to take a week off or want to take a break between seasons or whatever. if you are going to release 3 to 4 episodes at a time and then take a little bit of time before you release your next 3 to 4 episodes, I think that's okay. I would go ahead and break those up into seasons. Break it up into season 1, season 2, season 3, and let everyone know upfront what your cadence is going to be. The listeners, I spend a lot of time talking to people about the human attention span. The attention span of a human being is now 7 seconds. The attention span of a goldfish is 8 seconds. So we literally have a shorter attention span than that of a goldfish. If you've got to kind of take your listeners by the hand and tell them what your cadence is going to be. So let them know up front and talk about it repeatedly during your podcast. We're going to release 3 or 4 episodes, and then we're going to take some time off to develop new shows, and we'll be back on this date with new episodes. Literally guide them around by the hand as much as you possibly can, and tell people they then they'll know to expect your new episodes to show up on a certain date. And this also drives you to make that deadline too, right? So if you just say, we're going to do 3 to 4 episodes and then eventually we'll release 3 or 4 more, then what's going to happen to your own schedule? If you're like me, it's going to expand, and pretty soon you'll be 3 months down the road and you'll go, oh, that's right, I was going to release 3 or 4 new episodes of this podcast. I should probably get on that. So make sure that not only are you letting your listeners know when your podcast is going to come back, but give yourself a deadline as well. I need to have these new podcasts out by this time, because again, there's nothing that sort of lets listeners know, oh, hey, this new podcast dropped, or the show that I've been waiting for a while has dropped now. Apple Podcasts doesn't really do that. In fact, Apple Podcasts, if you haven't downloaded anything from a podcast in a while, it'll say, hey, are you bored with this podcast? Have you stopped listening to it? And it won't automatically download episodes. So make sure that you're literally taking your listeners by the hand and guiding them through what your release cadence will be. That's Taylor Frazier says, we mentioned having a specific launch date, but I've heard sometimes it takes iTunes a few weeks or months to post your podcast. Is that true? It is not. How do you know what date it will go live on iTunes? Rashmili, do you want to take that?
Sure. I'm trying to recall what exactly we did. This was, again, about 3.5 years ago. But from what I remember, it did not take a few weeks or months. It probably took about a week or so, but I did not receive this is when your podcast will go live on this particular day. I didn't get any of that. I just kept refreshing to see after like 3 or 4 days. I don't know if that's changed, but I don't see why it would. And same goes for Google Play or Play Music. At that time, it didn't take that long, maybe a day or 2 for that one. And Spotify, once we submitted our request to be featured on Spotify, that took maybe a few days as well.
Yeah, I let's see, the most recent show I just submitted to iTunes was about 2 weeks ago, and it took a day for them to approve it, and then a couple days after that for it to show up. So make sure that you submit to iTunes. I would submit to iTunes a full week maybe before your launch date, and put a little 2-minute trailer up, because you have to have some content already there. It used to be they used to want you to have like 5 or 6 episodes already uploaded before you submit to iTunes, before they would approve it. Now they just want to have any content whatsoever. So produce a little 2-minute trailer for your podcast, submit a week in advance, mention in the trailer the exact date of the podcast launch, and then iTunes, it'll be there easily in advance. Now I will say this to Rashmili's point, that the past couple shows that I've submitted to iTunes, I did not receive any notice that it had been approved either. So someone at Apple, Apple Podcasts, assuming there are still living, breathing human beings that work there, someone's either completely inundated during COVID with new podcasts, or they're just asleep at the switch. Rashmili, do you have any feel about if you're going to spend money on social media, where you get the biggest bang for your buck on social?
So personally, we never really spent money on managing our podcast or the marketing for our podcast. This was all a hobby for us, and we did what we could. We relied heavily on millennial instinct for these social media tools. We built everything ourselves. But I will say, but also our podcast content does not need to be monetized or even require paid marketing. So that's why I didn't do it, but I am exploring that for a podcast that I will be producing for my company, actually. So we would be spending money on LinkedIn, for example. I work at a tech company, so our clients and our potential audience members will primarily be in the tech space. They're going to be decision makers within software. So we'll be using LinkedIn primarily, and if for some reason we have the budget or the time, we'll probably explore Facebook as well. That's a dying social media platform, but I think for the people that we're trying to reach would be very helpful. But LinkedIn primarily for us. If you're just doing it for fun, I think Instagram would be the next best one.
I would agree. I think too, if you have the budget to purchase some social media, look at purchasing, or maybe if you have the ability to to do this, create some pre-rolls for YouTube. Don't be afraid to kind of think outside the box a little bit with social media, and don't just necessarily stick with the usual Facebook. Twitter can be a little expensive for the return, I think, but don't be afraid to think outside of kind of what's normal and show up in places where maybe podcast advertising doesn't necessarily usually show up. Even in Google Ads, display ads on websites and things like that. I've also had good success with sort of grassroots. Hey, if you're listening to this podcast and you like what you hear, tell 2 friends about us. We've had some reasonably good success with just a simple and really easy grassroots publicity campaign that's as simple as, please, if you're listening, tell someone about us. That can go a long way as well. I want to address this one question and then another question, and we should probably talk about how uploading works. So your host, how to choose a host and how to upload. But this question is interesting to me. Laura has a question. She started her podcast. It's called Shelter in Place on day 1 of the San Francisco area shelter in place mandate. She's made the most of her shelter in place. Let's put it that way. She started as a daily and thought she'd be doing it for 3 weeks. And 4 months later, she's completed season number 1 with 100 episodes in 4 months. She just launched season 2. Now she's weekly rather than daily. And she's got the first 4 episodes out. I have tons of great reviews on iTunes and 5-star ratings, but I've struggled to find the time to promote the podcast the way I'd like to because I spent most of my time creating content. What are the areas of promotion you think are non-negotiable, especially given that I have so much content out there? I think, Laura, first of all, you're doing everything right. You're capitalizing on a situation that everyone is in. You've clearly made the most of your situation. I love the fact that you created 100 episodes in 4 months. That's fantastic. The thing that it's easy to forget, I think, sometimes, because we do tend to get caught up in the promotion and how to get people to listen. So that we're not just sitting in our closets talking to ourselves. Everything's got to start with the content, right? Making the best content that you can possibly make has to start first. It's got to be the first thing on your list of priorities. So keep doing that. Keep creating the best, the most relevant shelter in place content that you possibly can, and then use your listeners, because if they're still with you after 100 episodes in 4 months, leverage those listeners who are passionate about what you're doing to help spread the word. the most valuable times in TV stations and radio stations learned this a long time ago. The most valuable promotion time and the most valuable promotion asset they have is their own air, right? So that's why you see promotions for your local TV news during your local TV news, or you see promotions for radio stations on their own air. You might think, well, they've already got those people. Why are they promoting their own programming on their own air? It's because they've already got those people that they're doing that. And so they try to get people to keep them coming back. And that's where the tell two friends about us is kind of my idea by that. So, don't be afraid to use your own product to promote your own product. But also, I think, creating a community. Have you created a Facebook group around your shelter in place idea? I don't know exactly what your content is, but I'm assuming it's, how to cope with, the people that you're sheltered in place with. I assume that's part of it. So maybe, you can sort of solicit best practices from your Facebook group about how to deal with things. That's a great way to get listeners to interact. As listeners interact, they become more engaged. As they become more engaged, they become more addicted to your content. And that's really kind of, what you want. And so, don't be afraid. Everything that we're doing here has got to start with creating quality content, because if the content's not there, it doesn't matter how much you spend on social media to get people to tune in. If people are going to tune in and it's a crap podcast, then they're not going to stick with you. So it's got to start with the content, Laura. You're doing everything right. Just keep doing it, be consistent, and keep creating really, really good content. Rashmili?
Yeah, really nothing to add. That was great. Yeah, like content is king in this particular media, and the transparency that Brian mentioned earlier. Like, you switched over from daily to weekly, so just let them know that this is how it's going to be from now on, and they're aware that they're still going to be able to expect you at a certain time, but in a different schedule or a calendar format.
Karen brings up a good point in the chat room. She says her podcast is for 40 plus women, and she's been spending a lot of time on Facebook and Instagram because that's where my audience is. Knowing where your audience is on social media is absolutely critical. Mm-hmm. We don't have to be, if we're a business, if we're a person, if we're a podcast, whatever we are, you don't have to be active on every social media platform if it doesn't make sense for you.
Yep.
If your audience isn't on TikTok, it's okay for you to be a 40 plus man or woman who's not on TikTok. In fact, I highly recommend it. So we don't have to be ever. Knowing where your audience is, knowing what they connect to is key. I love that idea of having the sort of intestinal fortitude to go, you know what, I feel drawn to Twitter, but I don't have to be there because that's not where my people are. Don't get fooled into thinking you have to be everything and everywhere on social media. Karen, that's a great point and very, very smart on your part. And please just don't do TikTok. That's all I ask. Okay, let's see. Jonathan has a question. Walk through distribution, marketing, promotion, step by step, starting with selection of a podcast host, what you'll supply them with to go to live. And wow, that's a long question. Not long. Actually, the question's very concise. It's a longer answer. Step by step, starting with selection of a host. Oh, so host. Jonathan, you're talking about an actual host, like a website host. Perfect. Rashmili, who do you host your podcast with?
So we host on Libsyn. When we first started, we used SoundCloud. That was great. I think the stats were the reason that we stopped using SoundCloud. They just weren't as robust as we probably would have liked them, the analytical tools there. So we actually switched over to Libsyn just earlier this year. We need to spend a little bit more time analyzing whatever data they can give us, but so far so good with Libsyn. I think we're going to explore Amazon S3 for the company podcast that I'll be producing.
Yeah, I as well started on SoundCloud as well. The thing that scares me about SoundCloud, and SoundCloud's a very, very user-friendly platform It's a good hosting platform. To Rashmili's point, the statistics are solid. The thing that scares me about SoundCloud, it's a British company. That's not what scares me. But what scares me is that every few months you'll see reports in the trade magazines that they're in financial trouble and they're going to go under. And then about 6 weeks later, somebody will bail SoundCloud out. And then a year later, you'll hear more reports that they're going to go under. And when I launched the Queen City Podcast Network in 2018, I was looking for a new host. And I knew I didn't want to go with SoundCloud because I was concerned about them in their financial trouble. And if they go under, then there's years of content that they could take with you. So the Libsyn at the time was the only host that would allow me, and I realize this may not be relevant to everyone, but Libsyn was the only host that I could find that would allow me to run an entire network of podcasts under one account. Every other host that I researched wanted me to have a separate account for every podcast, and we currently have 28 podcasts on the network, and I also manage another dozen or so for clients, and that's a lot of podcasts to have individual accounts for. And then I would have had to get individual stats for everything and then do math, and I don't get along anyway, and so that wasn't going to work. So I talked to Libsyn, and they said, absolutely, we can you can manage all of your network podcasts under one account. I can get aggregated data from all the podcasts. The data is really robust. There's a lot of good numbers you can find out. Not specific demographics about like income and who's listening, but where they're listening from, how many people are listening, how they're listening. A lot of hosts will give you that information. So if you want to host on Stitcher, that makes perfect sense. Libsyn makes perfect sense. It really, and this is an answer that doesn't always kind of satisfy people who ask this question, but ultimately the answer is do your homework. Do your due diligence, do your research into the podcast hosting sites, whether it's Blueberry or Libsyn or SoundCloud or Stitcher or wherever you want to go. There's literally hundreds of places where you can host a podcast. Do your research, find out what works best for you, find out what works for your budget. You're probably going to have to purchase a monthly arrangement with your host, even if it's only $10 or $15 a month, and most of them do charge based on the amount of space that you need, and it's the amount of space that you need for each for all of your podcasts. So bandwidth is really kind of how you get charged by these hosts. So Libsyn worked the best for me. SoundCloud worked really well for a long time, but you really kind of have to do your own homework and figure out kind of what works best for you. Any platform specific to certain audiences? No, it really doesn't matter. So your podcast host, where you host your podcast, is really just literally where you're storing your podcast file, right? It's listener agnostic, right? So there's no, you're not going to direct anyone specifically to Libsyn to listen to your podcast. You might direct someone to SoundCloud to listen to your podcast, but the bulk of your listeners are going to come from Apple Podcasts. We get about 80 to 85% of our traffic on the network comes from Apple Podcasts. And then there'll be some other folks who will listen to Stitcher. The Android folks will listen to Stitcher. Google has never really kind of made the inroads for listeners that I think they thought they would, but Apple Podcast is still the biggest, the biggest player in terms of where people go to listen to podcasts. So it doesn't matter where you host your podcast. What matters is where people are listening to your podcast. So nobody, a listener who doesn't already know about Libsyn isn't suddenly just going to stumble across Libsyn and start listening to podcasts. They're going to go to Apple Podcasts first. So literally where you host your platform is really just mostly based on your own needs for hosting. And Rashmili, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I saw some questions come through about Anchor specifically. I saw a little while ago. I want to make sure they're addressed. I haven't used Anchor, but I have not seen the negative reviews either. Brian, do you have any experience with Anchor as much?
I don't, because Anchor is still fairly new, and I was already established with Libsyn when Anchor came along. I do know some folks who do use Anchor, and they love it. Let's see. I'm also seeing Podbean, free for up to 5 hours of content a month. Podbean is a perfectly fine host. Again, it really just, it depends on your needs. How much are you going to release? If you're going to release an hour a week, then that's only 4 hours a month. That's under the 5 hours of content a month. So you're looking at a free account. Now, keeping in mind that you get what you pay for, right? So the statistics on Podbean may not be great, but if free is important to you, and it is for a lot of podcasters, then that is a perfectly viable solution. Question about Blogtalk Radio. I am not hugely familiar with Blogtalk Radio. That's not something that I ever really honestly even looked at. I know some folks. It feels a little bit like public access for podcasts, but not that there's anything at all wrong with that. Again, it really just kind of depends on your own the personal needs. Rashmili, do you have any experience with Blogtalk?
I don't actually. I'm not familiar with that.
So when you upload to your host, everybody always wants to know, like, do we have to upload to all these different places? And the answer is you don't. Your wherever you're hosting your podcast will upload everything to everywhere that you want it to, right? So Libsyn gives you the opportunity to choose destinations, but your host will have, now you will still have to submit to Apple Podcasts, and you can do that. I'm going to show you real quick here. Let's see how quick I can pull this up, because I did not actually prepare for this part of it, but I think I can pull it up pretty quickly. So Apple Podcasts has a specific site for podcasters where you submit. And let me share my screen. Here we go. So it is, let's see. So you should be seeing a aubergine colored screen that actually has my Apple Podcast ID on it, which I probably should have thought about before. But and then you enter your password, and then you go into the site. So now you will have a separate account, and it's going to send me, hold on. I'm going to unshare for a moment, because it's, yes, I know that. Here we go. All right, so I just got the code. Hold on one second. Let me just enter this code. We're going to allow. And we're going to go ahead and trust this site for some reason. Okay. So let me share my screen here one more time. And we're in the process of connecting to apple.com, which is the site where you go to submit your show to Apple. I think it's going well. All right, there we go. Okay. So this is a visual example of all the shows that I've submitted to Apple Podcasts. Some of these are clients, and some of these are network-related podcasts. But these are all the podcasts that I've submitted. So what you do to submit, it's actually very simple. You'll need your RSS feed from your host, right? So your host will assign your podcast an RSS feed. RSS feed, RSS just stands for really simple syndication, and it is the code that every place where you will find your podcast uses to connect to your podcast. So your podcast is given this ID code. It's called an RSS feed, and that's how you submit. So if you want to add a podcast to Apple Podcasts, you're going to click on this plus here, which means I'm going to add a show. You're going to paste your RSS feed into this gap, and let me find an RSS feed here real quick just so I can show you. This is the back end of Libsyn, by the way, which I was going to go over. If I have time, I still will. But okay, so you're going to paste your RSS feed into this slot, right? And then you're going to validate it. Now, validate it means there's already some content published to this RSS feed. Your image is the right size. It needs to be 1400 by 1400, 300 DPI. So your image is the right size. All of your metadata is accurate. And I'll talk about what that is in a minute. And everything, basically, you dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's with your host for your podcast, because Apple needs certain information in order to be able to publish it, in order to be able to approve it. So if once you know that all that information is in place, all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed at your host, you then go to iTunes Connect, and you can just search for Podcast Connect on Google, by the way, to get to this page, Podcasts Connect, in order to get to this page. So you've got everything in order on your host. You've pasted the RSS feed. You're going to click on Validate up here in the upper right-hand corner. It's going to run a little test, and it's going to check all those things that I was just talking about with your host. Is your image the right size? Is your metadata in place? Is all that stuff accurate? Is all that stuff, everything that you need for Apple to be able to communicate with your host needs to be in order. It's going to take a moment. And it will let you know if everything is in order, which this should be, because this is a podcast that already exists on Apple Podcasts. So if everything's in order, it will say, hey, great, everything's in order, go ahead and submit. If everything is not in order, it will tell you specifically which piece of data it's looking for that is not the way it wants it to be. I'm only going to give this a few more seconds, but it will basically tell you. So if everything's in order and it says, hey, successful, your podcast is validated, then you submit it, and then you just wait for Apple to decide that, that your podcast is worthy of inclusion on Apple Podcasts. Now, spoiler alert, they accept every podcast that gets them submitted. So you don't have to, there's no bar to clear. If, you want to produce a podcast and submit it, they will accept it. There's over 1.2 million podcasts on Apple Podcasts now. There's been, since COVID started in March, there's been 250,000 new podcasts launched. Podcasts and babies. That's what I think is coming out of COVID. All right. Well, anyway, so you will see at some point this will validate this feed, and so you'll see the thing that says either, hey, congratulations, everything's in order, click submit, or hey, you need, your image is the wrong size, fix your image, and then you just go back into your site and fix the size of your image. So let me show you in Libsyn here real quick. I see we only have about 5 minutes left. Rashmili, do you have anything you want to add at all?
Nope.
Okay.
Good.
Make sure I'm not talking too much. So with Libsyn, and this is Libsyn Pro, but your basic Libsyn is still kind of structured the same way. And really, honestly, most podcast hosts are structured this way. The steps will basically be the same. But you're going to go to content. You're going to add a new episode. Okay, it's going to give you this window. You're going to add a media file. So you're going to do this. You don't have to populate the form with metadata. We didn't really get a chance to talk about metadata, but metadata is just basically, as you edit your podcast, there's a window where you can add the title of the podcast, the date it was released, the category that your podcast goes in, things like that. You don't have to do that in your editing software, but you can. Or just upload from hard drive, right? So we're just going to upload this from the hard drive. This should take me straight to a folder from an external drive where I store a lot of my podcasts. Everything is running more slowly than I'd like. Right, so we're just going to go to this. So I'm going to go into the folder. So we're uploading the Comedy Zone podcast. I'm going into the folder that hosts all of our networks' proprietary shows. I'm going to go to Comedy Zone. The show we recorded yesterday and released today is dated today, 10/22/20. I've labeled my folder CZPC, Comedy Zone Podcast 10/22/20 Final, right? So I know that this is the episode that we'll be releasing today. So I'm going to double click on that. It'll start to upload that episode. Now, while this is uploading, I can go into details. I can write the title, the subtitle, a description, change the category, tags and keywords. Apple Podcasts, because Apple being Apple, they want their own information. So you have to enter basically the same information you have up here for Libsyn that actually populates everywhere else but Apple. Apple wants their own information. So you go ahead and basically copy and paste everything there in Apple. What type of episode is it? Season number, episode number. Is it explicit? Is it clean? Then what the author is. So once you have that filled out, and I realize I'm going through this really quickly, and the podcast is up. The file name's already in use by the show, which we knew because I actually uploaded the show yesterday. That's okay. Under normal circumstances, this would say, hey, successful, you've uploaded the episode of your show. If you want specific artwork for this particular episode, you can do that here. And then you can schedule when you want it to release. So I release all my new episodes at 3:30 in the morning on the day that they're going to release, so that when people wake up, in the morning, then the episodes are there. If you do have advertising, you can place advertising slots according to time in your show. This is a pretty advanced thing. If you're fortunate enough to have actual advertising, you can literally build breaks into your content if you know what time in the file you want the breaks to include. And so that's kind of a really, really quick look at kind of how to upload a show. Once you've done it once, it gets much easier. As I mentioned, in Libsyn, you can, that's fine. You can choose where you want, your shows to go, right? So there's a whole bunch of different places where you can set your podcast to go, including YouTube, including a bunch of places like Deezer that I've never even heard of. So, again, every hosting location is kind of more or less the same. You just have to kind of learn your way around the platform. Are there marketing advantages for one platform over the other? No, not really. They're all, again, no one is going to go specifically to Libsyn to hear your podcast. They're going to go to Apple or someplace else. Quick, let's see, Rashmili, that took much longer than I'm expected. Any kind of final thoughts as we're just about at the end? Anything else that you want to make sure that you leave people with?
Well, besides everything else that we told you today, just remember, have fun with your podcast. The technicals, you will be able to figure it out. What will draw people to your content is that you stay authentic. If it's business or even just for fun, just talk about what you're an expert at, because you're an expert at what you do.
Exactly. And what I kind of, what I always tell folks, because everybody asks me, oh, there's 1.25 million podcasts on Apple Podcasts. Why should I do a podcast? Because you have the ability to, because you've got something to say, and because nobody else sees the world the way you see it. No one else has experienced what you've experienced. Nobody else tells the stories that you tell. And and even if you don't have a huge audience, there's somebody out there who needs to hear the things that you have to say. So it's not just a matter of, oh, I don't think anyone's going to listen to me. The people will find you, and it doesn't matter how niche your podcast is. If it's something that you're super passionate about, and if it comes from a pure place within you, and you're really passionate about it, other people are passionate about it too. And so, the beautiful thing, the thing that I love the most about podcasting is that it really levels the playing field, and it gives everybody a voice, and it gives everybody the opportunity to be heard. And if you've got one of these, if you've got a smartphone, you've got the ability to record something right now and have it posted somewhere in 5 minutes. And think about, that is something that's never existed, in the history of this planet. And we're on the cutting edge of a new form of media, and it's really exciting. And I could go on for another hour about it, but I won't. Rashmili, thank you so much for your information. How can people find you? How can they listen to your podcast, and where can folks find you on the internets?
So you can find my podcast wherever you find other podcasts. In the chat, but again, we are Carolina Desi. It's the same handle for IG, Twitter, Facebook. We're all wherever you find podcasts.
Perfect. And that's Carolina Desi, but it's DESI, correct?
Yes, Desi. Maybe I said it already, but Desi is the term used to describe anyone from the South Asian subcontinent. So it's a little bit more inclusive for anyone who is from that region.
Awesome. Rashmili, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian. This is fun. Thanks for joining, everyone.
And so I am Brian from the Queen City Podcast Network, powered by North Carolina. The Queen City Podcast Network, for those of you not in Charlotte, is a network. It's a hyper-local network all about Charlotte. So every single podcast, there's 28 shows on the network right now. It's all about Charlotte, from news and current events to comedy to music to food to entertainment. If it's happening in Charlotte, we're talking about it. You can find it at queencitypodcastnetwork.com. And of course, all of our podcasts are available in all the usual places as well. And you can reach me at brian@queencitypodcastnetwork.com. brian@queencitypodcastnetwork.com. So I hope we were able to kind of fill in some blanks for you. I know that this is kind of, this is an intimidating part of podcasting, right? The creating the podcast and talking about things you're passionate about is almost the easy part. It's the, how do we upload it? How do we, how do we promote it? How do we get people to listen? That really becomes the hard part. So we're going to talk a lot about that next week in the festival. I am let's see, someone asked earlier, are we appearing in any other panels? Rashmili, you were in 2 today.
Yes, today was my full schedule. I was in a panel earlier today speaking about representation in podcasting and diversity and inclusion within audio. And then this is my last session for the event. So I'll catch Brian next week and all of his sessions.
Yeah, and I've got 3 or 4 next week, talking about how to avoid burnout, talking about monetization, Monday at noon with Stacy Sims, who has produced a podcast in Charlotte about being the mother of a diabetic child. She has created a real niche and a real community with her podcast, and she's been able to monetize pretty successfully. And so that's on Monday. The other ones, let's see, burnout, I talked about that one. pitching your podcast, both to advertisers, but also to podcast producers. That's one coming up. It's Joni Deutsch from WFAE, and I will be accepting your podcast pitches, and we're going to tell you kind of almost Shark Tank style how to improve your pitch. And then there's another one that I've lost sight of which one, the other one that I'm doing next week. But thank you, everyone. Again, you can see the schedule, charlottepodcastfestival.com. If you like what we're doing, go ahead and pick up a t-shirt or two. They make great Christmas and Hanukkah gifts, so don't forget even though it doesn't feel like it, the holidays are coming up not too long from now. So charlottepodcastfestival.com, and of course hashtag CLT Podcast Fest on the social medias. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging out with us. It's been a blast. Rashmili, thank you for your time. And we will see you guys hopefully at Happy Hour tomorrow night, and in a whole bunch of other sessions next week as this thing rolls into week number 4. So thanks, everybody.